Hi, I'm Kim Keedle, the physiotherapist and performance coach for Romain Grosjean, a Formula 1 driver driving for Haas Formula 1 team, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the Gold Coast Marathon and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. As per the intro, the aim of this show is to educate and inspire you towards the pursuit of your own physical best performance. We do this through interviews featuring some of the world's top physical performers and also some of the world's preeminent experts in their chosen fields. Each week, we'll bring you a range of episodes, including expert editions, interest editions, coaches' corners, and featured performer episodes. In today's conversation, episode 168 features F1 racing physiotherapist Kim Keedle. On this interest edition, we go behind the scenes of the world of F1 racing to learn and discover just what it is that the drivers do to remain healthy and performing at their physical best. This is a fascinating insight into the world of F1 racing, the loads that the drivers endure, the training that it takes to keep them at their best, and who better to bring this to life than Kim Keedle. By way of bio, Kim Keedle is a physiotherapist who graduated with a Bachelor of Physiotherapy from Melbourne University in 2012. Years later, after work within elite sport in the UK, Kim was offered a coveted position with the newly founded Haas Formula 1 racing team. From there, Kim took up a position to be the physiotherapist for Romain Grosjean, Haas F1 Team Driver, and has now been on the F1 racing circuit for several years. You're going to really enjoy this. This was a whole lot of fun to record. Here is my conversation with Formula 1 racing physiotherapist Kim Keedle. Well, this has me buzzing. Kim Keedle, physiotherapist for F1 racing driver Romain Grosjean, and formerly high performance program director for Haas Racing Team. I am really excited to be able to dig a little bit deeper into this world of F1 racing with you. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks a lot for having me, mate. Appreciate the time.
Before we threw live, Kim, I mentioned that I think like a lot of people at the moment, I had a acknowledgement of F1 racing. I knew some of the drivers. I can honestly say I would not have sat down and watched a race from go to woe ever. Certainly watched highlights here and there. But it was the Netflix documentary Drive to Survive that actually the first guest of this show, Alistair Day, insisted that I watch because he believed I would enjoy it, that really opened my eyes, and I've become a bit of an F1 junkie. So the timing of this couldn't be better.
Perfect, mate. Yeah, it was I actually haven't seen the series myself, but we've had a lot of positive feedback about it, and I think it's really opened up Formula 1 to quite a broad population, which is always a positive thing because it's an impressive sport in some regards, and these drivers are quite impressive talent. So it's always nice to give them some exposure to the general public.
I mean, I've mentioned this series to quite a few people in the physiotherapy setting, and some are like, "Oh, how good is it?" And others like, "Oh, really? That sounds great." Have you noticed going race to race? You've just left Monaco and you're back at Geneva now. Have you noticed any differences in the crowds or the awareness of drivers since this went live?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I think we have. At Formula 1 races, I mean, as you'd expect, there's always proper Formula 1 fans there. But now there's a lot more people recognising different staff. For example, Gunter Steiner, our team principal, I believe featured quite heavily on the show. So more people behind the scenes are probably recognisable now, and people have a greater understanding of what's actually happening behind the scenes as opposed to just seeing the cars go round and round on the track. So Formula One's a big organisation, mate, and it takes a lot of work from quite a large team to get both cars on the track for race weekend. So it's quite nice for people to be able to see that, because otherwise you'd have no appreciation about what's actually occurring.
I feel like it humanised the sport.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I think traditionally Formula One's been very glamorous, and you used to have drivers that were paid multi-million-dollar contracts, etc. And then perhaps over the last 10 years, it had sort of lost a bit of its glamour for a variety of reasons. And then 2 or 3 years ago, some new owners took over Formula One, and they've certainly tried to make it a lot more family friendly and give access to a wider range of people, which is really positive. You
use the phrase big organisation, just to put scope around it. Like, how big is it? I mean, even like the teams, I was impressed about how large they are in terms of employees and budgets. So, can you wrap some numbers around this world?
Yeah, absolutely. So Romain Grosjean is the driver that I work for, and he drives the Haas Formula 1 team. So we're a little bit different, and we're quite new in Formula 1. We have offices split between North Carolina and Oxford in England. I think we have about 120 or 130 staff working for us. And then to each race, there's at least 60 staff that travel to each race. So there's 21 races throughout the season. But there's at least 60, probably more like 70 or 80 staff travelling to each race throughout the year. Bigger teams such as Mercedes or Ferrari may have up to 500 to 700 staff, somewhere between there, and their budgets annually might be somewhere like 250 million to 300 million pounds. So yeah, it's quite a big show, and there's quite a lot of money and investment into the sport.
It's stunning, and hence why you use the term impressive sport. You also use the term impressive talents, the drivers, the athletes. And I want to come back to that, but before we throw to the athletes, Kim, let us in on your world, your Genesis story, and how did you find yourself, an Aussie boy, graduating Melbourne University, I believe, circa 2012, in the world that you now inhabit? To be honest, it was a bit of right time, right place, like often these things are. So I still have to pinch myself occasionally when I'm in and around the circuit and at races, and some of the things that are going on around me about how did I possibly get here. But as you said, I graduated from the University of Melbourne in 2012 with a Bachelor of Physiotherapy, and always had an interest in sport. So I worked at a private practice in Melbourne for 2 or 3 years, and whilst there, I was also working with Werribee Tigers in the VFL, which was really good, being around that team environment and having access to North Melbourne's physios and a really good nurturing environment. Then, as most Australians do, I moved over to London in the UK, mainly to travel, to be honest with you, mate. But after working there for sort of 6 months, I was getting a little bit bored and wanted to get back involved in sport. So I took a role as the head physio for performance sports at the University of Leeds, where I sort of oversaw 15 sports, but particularly took care of a junior elite swimming program, triathlon program, and took care of runners and also a couple of Olympic weightlifters, which was really good, mate. It gave me great exposure to a variety of athletes and really taught me a lot about sort of amateur elite sport, people that are competing in the Olympics or competing in the Commonwealth Games or for, junior national teams, which is really good exposure to those athletes. And I took a lot of really valuable lessons away from that. And then whilst working there, there was an Australian doctor working in the Formula One paddock who sort of got in touch and it was a really good opportunity to come and work in Formula One for Haas F1 team at the time, and then my role sort of developed from there, now working purely with Romain. And I believe at Haas, Kim, you were instrumental in developing some of the performance program, I guess you'd phrase it, for the team before then you went exclusively to work with your driver, Romain Grosjean. Yeah, that's correct. So at the moment, there's quite a bit of
development within Formula One, looking into sort of how their teams perform in the human aspect. So there's been so much time and money spent in investing in the car and developing the car. But you've got to remember there's such a big team that's responsible for building the car, for making sure that the car's running to its optimal performance, et cetera, et cetera. So they're now investing some time and money into making sure that those people are fit and healthy and performing well. And so I was brought into the team for that reason, to try and build a performance program to make sure that could be achieved.
I was before we threw live, I was really impressed that part of that role was not just focused on the driver. That was also on I guess, for want of a better phrase, some of the support team, the team employees, the improving pit stops as an example. So what did that look like, and what do you go and implement there? You do a task analysis, do you, when you break it down? Or
Yeah, spot on. So that was a little bit of a curveball for me, really. Formula One was a sport probably similar to yourself. I had an interest in. I watched it because there was Australian drivers in Mark Webber and Daniel Ricciardo, but I certainly didn't know the intricacies of the sport. So I think it's just once you get exposed to pit stops and you sort of perform a needs analysis, what needs to be achieved to perform this as optimal as possible, and then you work backwards from there and start making a bit of a plan. So simple things that we did was just start formalising pit stop practice, so making sure that the boys were doing a warm-up and sort of getting into the right sort of mental zone to practice the skill, and then practicing it in a structured way 3 or 4 times a weekend to make sure that it was consistent and repeatable. So, I mean, that's something very easy to implement, but it was actually quite powerful in the first year that I was at Haas, and we had some really good improvement throughout the season.
And improvements is in times reducing?
Yeah, sure. Times and consistency. Yeah, so a quick pit stop will never win you a race necessarily, but a slow or a poorly executed pit stop may lose you a race or may lose positions in the race. So we aim for pit stops somewhere between 2 to 3 seconds, where 2's a very fast pit stop and 3 seconds is a good pit stop. But anything anything slower than 3 seconds really has a big impact on strategy and may lose you positions in the race. So it's really important to just have consistent performances, 3 seconds or less within a pit stop.
Are there any pit stop injuries, like overuse injuries that you were dealing with?
There's several different positions. Sorry, I'll just give you a quick rundown. So there's in every pit stop, so there's 4 tyres. On each tyre, there's someone taking the wheel off, someone putting the wheel on, and then a gunman to unscrew the nuts and then to screw the nuts back on. So the guns in particular have very high power and create a lot of torque, particularly through the wrist. So often the gunmen, as we call them, may have some wrist injuries or some thumb injuries or little niggles going on through there. So that's one area that I've sort of spent a little bit of time treating and managing. And then the tyres can be quite heavy. The rear tyres are 18 kilos, and you're trying to throw that onto the car as fast as possible. So when you're doing that repeatedly over the course of a weekend, on top of working really long hours, being under a car or bending over a car, some injuries can occur. So which is why sort of keeping them strong and healthy throughout the season can be important for the team in particular.
So from the Haas Racing Performance Program, obviously you jumped over to work exclusively with Romain Grosjean. I think the easiest way to wrap our minds around, what that looks like across a March to December racing calendar, that's the racing, but maybe we break it down into pre-season and the racing phase. Like, what are you getting up to in pre-season? What are the goals, objectives, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. The season runs from March to the start of December. December's usually a month off, and then we'll start. There is some training going on there, but it's less formalised. And then January we'll really start increasing the load. Romain is particularly interested in endurance sports. He quite enjoys running, cycling, swimming, and particularly here in Geneva during the winter there's a lot of snow, so cross-country skiing. So a lot of his endurance work will be based around that. So we might do cross-country skiing 2 or 3 times a week. And then also we'll have quite a large strength focus as well. So we'll be in the gym probably 3 or 4 sessions per week. working on full body strength, to be honest with you, but particularly focusing on back strength and on trunk core strength, if that's what you want to call it, plus also neck strength as well.
And certainly the neck strengthening we want to dive into here, but anyone that did see or has watched Drive to Survive will see some of the pretty impressive harnesses and things that therapists like yourself working with the drivers, get them to do. But with the gym sessions, so you're obviously developing the program, progressing it, working on tying that in with the overall loads of the aerobic work, as you said, run, cycle, swim, cross-country, ski. Are there goals that you obviously set around benchmarks and things, or is that something that you would normally do?
Yes, absolutely. So, we touched on neck strength, so we may as well quickly discuss that now. This year, unfortunately, we didn't actually do any formal testing, but over the last couple of years, Romain has done some neck strength testing, where they've looked at his maximum voluntary contraction, so his MVC. This is all isometrically. Of neck extension, cervical extension, cervical flexion, lateral flexions, and rotations, using a modified dynamometer, which a company in England has developed. From there, they take 50% of his MVC for whatever movement, and then they look at his strength endurance. So they see how long he can hold that 50% level in seconds. So that might be a minute 30, or that might be 2 minutes. And so from that, we got some really useful data, which we've then been able to improve on, particularly for him. His maximum voluntary contraction, his maximum strength is quite good, but he needed a little bit of work on his endurance. So in the pre-season this year, whilst we always touch on his top-end strength, we've also been doing endurance work. So as you said, we have a modified or a specialised neck harness, which allows us to do multi-plane movements, and we can just hook that up to a cable machine, and we'll do various loads, and we might be holding for a minute 30 or 2 minutes, or adapting the time frames and then adding perturbation to it. So maybe adding some vibration or adding external load, or making him do some other form of cognitive task during that.
There was that great video that F1 shared on their Instagram gallery of your driver, Romain, juggling whilst on
some form of balance board.
A balance board, and I think it had 1 million views, and I thought it was a great insight into the athleticism, but also the cognitive abilities of these, as you say, impressive talents.
To be honest, that isn't a regular training modality of ours per se. But when we spend a lot of time around each other and we see each other most days, it's always good to have a little bit of fun in the gym. So I think we were having a bit of fun at that stage, and that was just something cheeky that he wanted to do. So
impressive.
It's quite impressive, and I think I'd be flat on my face if I tried that, to be honest with you. So
and on that, while we touch on that, the cognitive demands, the mental acuity, of these athetes. I heard you comment on the BJSM, British Journal of Sports Medicine podcast, something around the terms of the amount of memorization they need for certain commands. What struck me as I watched Drive to Survive is how calm these drivers appear under conditions where, I've sat in a V8 race car and I felt like I could barely breathe, let alone let alone speak with any control or sensibility. So, can you let us into the world of what these guys are processing, how fast, and how is it that they can be so calm? It's almost like they're robots.
Yeah, it was one of the things that really impressed me, particularly when I started to find out the different functions or the different settings of the car that they had to know off by heart, and how quickly they need to be able to change those. This is whilst maybe going around a corner or overtaking a car or doing 340 kilometres an hour, which is quite impressive. So for people that might have seen a Formula One steering wheel, it's very easily, you can just Google search and have a look if you're interested. There's various switches and toggles and rotary buttons and on-off buttons on the steering wheel. It looks like you might be flying an aeroplane. That's how complicated these things are. But he's required to memorise roughly 30 different functions that he might have to scroll through on the steering wheel whilst driving. And often that requires, pushing of 3 different buttons or something like that. Now that's to change the setting of the car, maybe going into a certain corner, or there might be some tyre degradation and they need to change where the car's braking, whether it's braking at the front or braking at the back. And so he'll have an engineer that can come over his radio and instruct him what setting he needs to change to, and then he needs to do that pretty quickly to make sure he's getting the most performance out of the car. But it's certainly not something that I think I would be that comfortable doing, going 300 kilometres an hour and changing settings on my steering wheel. I mean, I have it hard enough just setting cruise control on my car here in Geneva. So
brilliant, Kim. So cognitively, impressive talents, and it's just got to be seen to be believed. And I really like what F1 have done by bringing that audibility to what's happening in the cockpit.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the car.
I think we've just finished Monaco, so something pretty unique about that track is it's a street circuit, really, really narrow streets, virtually impossible to overtake. But you're also driving a centimetre away from the wall, and if you make one mistake, you're in the wall and you've crashed. And so to be able to be switched on for a 2-hour race and continue to do that repeatably without any mistakes, is quite impressive.
Yeah, amazing. So pre-season, you've taken the driver up to pre-season. What I just struggle to comprehend is this 21 race schedule where you are trying to be outputting at your physical best for that whole time in amongst a very hectic travel schedule. So how on earth does it work? And then what does your day, week, role look like throughout all this?
21 races throughout the year, going to Australia, going through Asia, going to South America, North America, and then through Europe. So covering, quite a large portion of the globe. We are limited occasionally by access to gyms, particularly through Europe where the facilities aren't so great. And then other races we go to, we have access to very good gyms. So our training throughout the year always depends on what's available to us, and we'll have to modify slightly depending on where we are. We also then have the issue of jet lag and changing time zones. So for long haul flights or flights to where we're having significant time zone changes, we'll always adapt our sleeping patterns a few days before to make sure when we're landing we're minimising the effects of jet lag so that we can get into a normal routine and get into our normal sort of training structure leading into a week. Just over a normal race week. So a race is always on a Sunday. Saturday is qualifying and practice. Friday is practice. We will always arrive on a Tuesday or a Wednesday prior to the race to sort of, acclimatise ourselves, if that's the right word. And Thursday's a media day where he has media all day and some meetings with his engineers and these things.
And Kim, so that's the layout of the week. And then you're obviously, as a physiotherapist, you might be tending to the driver's physical needs, perhaps as niggles, strains, aches, pains, injuries, doing what most people would identify physios would do, some hands-on manual therapies, but obviously with your strength and conditioning background and, your key role there, you're also obviously controlling training loads, etc.
Yes, sure. So physio-wise, look, touch wood, Romain's actually been very healthy. In the pre-season when our training loads were quite high and we were really pushing him, there was more physio demands in terms of soreness and niggles and these things. This year, during the races, he's been pretty good. There's been no acute injuries, which has been really nice. We will often treat on a Friday evening. So Friday, he's in the car for 3 hours, which is a lot of driving, and he'll often have some sore or stiff neck, some muscle soreness, some muscle DOMs in his neck on a Friday night, which we'll often treat. Or he might just want to tune up with some other areas that he feels are tight, or he might have some discomfort in those. So Friday night, we normally treat. Thursday, we'll always try to get a good training stimulus in. He never likes being too sore when he's getting into the car, but I always still like to try and have some load going through on the Thursday, or at least doing some more power work, or you might call it a priming session, sort of to get him into the weekend.
And what might you include in a priming session?
Yeah, so we'll always try and do a couple of heavier strength things. So that might be some heavy squats. And then we'll go with low volume, so maybe 3 to 5 heavy squats, and then we might do some plyometrics, some jumps, or some med ball slams or something like that. And we'll always do a little bit of core work regarding to that, and then we'll often do some form of pushing exercise as well for the upper body. So it might be some plyometric push-ups or something heavy strength-wise in regards to that. So just to get him, that stimulus without killing him too much.
You mentioned there's a lot that goes on in a week. Who else is part of the medical team?
Living in Geneva as well, part of our little team here. So there's Romain, obviously the driver. There's myself as the physio and coach. And then we also have another coach as well. His name's Daniel Sims, who's worked with Romain for quite a few years now. So we've got a nice little team here working in Geneva for his training and preparation. Then at race weeks, we also have a doctor who takes care of several drivers, but he's always there on call for Romain as we need. Romain also has a sports psychologist that he talks to weekly, who's based in Paris, who's been very, very valuable to him. And then we also have it's a close friend of Romain's, is somewhat a mentor, who attends all the races with us as well. And he's just a really nice calming influence in Romain and a really nice sort of sounding board for any of the technical driving things or any of the engineering setup things that Romain needs assistance with. So that's our little team, and we've got it working quite nicely at the moment.
And on race day, where are you to be found, Kim? I do know in Drive to Survive that when Romain had some tough times there that were featured in the documentary, that you can audibly be heard comforting Romain. So we know that you're somewhere in the labyrinth of the Haas racing team. But yeah, typically, do you do anything just before the race, and then what are you doing during the race?
Yes, unfortunately, I am heard on that Drive to Survive thing, which I'm not comfortable too much with. But anyway, no, that was a good experience. Race day. To be honest, most of his work's done by race day. He has some meetings with engineers for final strategy and final setup of the car. He always has to do some meet and greet with sponsors and these sorts of things. But we have structured his race day to make it as least cluttered as possible so that he can really focus on driving. That's probably an inelegant way of saying it, but we want it to be pretty smooth flowing for a Sunday. 2 hours prior to the race, it's just me and him in his driver's room. So that he can start, getting into his own zone and have no external distractions. We'll do a warm up an hour before he gets into the car, or an hour before the race starts. Where we'll do various movements, nothing too complex. And then during the race, there's a crazy rule in Formula One. I'm not allowed to have any involvement in the performance of the car, so unfortunately I just sit back and watch it on TV and relax during the race, which is quite a nice way of viewing it.
In the driver's room? In the
driver's room, or in hospitality somewhere where there's a TV, and I'll have a headset on so that I can listen to his radio with his communication between the engineer, and I'll also have a timing screen so I can see what's sort of happening with more detail throughout the race.
And what emotions are you feeling through the race? I mean, you see firsthand, and I think this is part of the attraction of the Drive to Survive documentary series, that you see these high performance individuals, these cars, and you kind of just go, it's a high performance environment. But when you see the emotional side, the blood, sweat and tears, you must be riding the emotional highs and lows every minute of those races.
Yeah, it's really interesting working with an individual athlete. Last year I started formally working with Romain. For the first half of the season, he had a really, really difficult first half of the season through some mistakes that he made and also some bad luck. That it's sport, so things can happen. And he was under quite a bit of pressure, and that was sort of probably the first time in my career where I'd also felt quite a lot of pressure. You really start questioning, am I doing things correctly to make sure that he's in the right mental state or physical state to perform? And you know that it's not necessarily your fault, but you always sort of internalise it and think, am I doing something wrong here? Is he comfortable with me so that he can perform really well? And anyway, it was a really good learning experience, and you're really nervous before those races and you're really hoping for a good result. But as our relationship has grown and developed, I think we have a really good trust now, and I'll always still be a little bit of nervous for him before the race, and really hoping that he does well, because I know the amount of work that he's put in, and I really hope that he succeeds on race day. And then once the race starts, I'm I've got good faith in his ability, so I'm pretty relaxed now. I'm always watching keenly and always keeping an eye on the different strategies maybe or how he's shaping up through the race. But I'm certainly more relaxed now than what I was when I first started working with him.
And I mean, what happens when there's a crash? Like obviously your driver Romain was involved in a sizable crash. I can't recall the round or the race, but it was quite a crash. So what happens there? What are you thinking and what are you doing?
Yeah, sure. So in Barcelona last year, well, he had a couple of big crashes last year, but in Barcelona in particular, it was at the start of the race. He ran wide going into the first corner and ended up spinning, so that he was going head on into coming traffic, which must be pretty terrifying in the car, and it's certainly pretty crazy watching that on TV. Look, the cars are pretty safe and pretty indestructible, so I'm never too worried about his safety necessarily. I know that most of the time he's going to get out of the car relatively unscathed. Once there is a big crash, he has to go to a medical centre and be checked over by doctors and observed for somewhere between 15 minutes and half an hour. And then I have access to him after that, where we can do a musculoskeletal screen and make sure there's certainly no acute damage, but assess any areas that might have been affected in the crash. So the big crash last year in Barcelona, he got away with relatively unscathed. I mean, naturally he had some neck soreness and some upper back and shoulder soreness, and he'd banged his elbow quite hard on the edge of the car and had a cut on his elbow. And so then we just treat accordingly. And luckily he recovered pretty quickly from that without any major issues.
And I heard you on the BJSM podcast mention that in terms of G-forces, which we'll go to in a moment, but that was up to 13 G-forces or 13 times body weight. That he was subjected to,
which is large. He has had bigger in his career. I don't know the exact numbers, but he's in that impact. He had 13 G's of force going through his body, so that's 13 times body weight of force getting thrown through his body. So which is quite large,
and hence the need for a great physiotherapist like Kim Keedle.
I'm not sure about great, but hence the need for a physiotherapist, definitely.
You're listening to Formula One racing physiotherapist Kim Keedle on this, an interest edition of the Physical Performance Show, taking us behind the scenes of what is required to keep an F1 race driver at their physical best. Support for today's show comes from the Gold Coast Marathon. Just like the Physical Performance Show, the Gold Coast Marathon encourages runners of all ages and abilities to push their boundaries and strive to complete a personal challenge. The Gold Coast Marathon is held annually on the first weekend in July and is a must-do event for any budding athlete, weekend warrior, or family looking for a challenge to complete together. Run for the good times at the Gold Coast Marathon. Visit goldcoastmarathon.com.au. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. In addition to traditional session-to-session pay-as-you-go appointments, we also offer some unique and award-winning fixed-fee services, including our very popular monthly wellness booster packs. To find out more about Pogo Physio's services, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with Formula One racing physiotherapist Kim Keedle. Kim, talking about forces, G-forces, a lot of people, throw it around, but, what does it mean? And then let us into the forces that these drivers are subjected to, with regards to their neck and then their legs, and open up the G-force world.
Absolutely. So, G-force is a gravitational force. So, if you're standing at sea level, the force that your body is feeling is one gravitational force, or 1G. So it's effectively your body weight. So then 2Gs is 2 times body weight, 3Gs is 3 times body weight, and so on. So something I probably didn't realise before coming into Formula One is the length of time that these drivers have to withstand G-forces, particularly when they're under a heavy braking, so braking very quickly into a corner, or when they're going quite fast around high-speed corners and they've got a lot of lateral G-force going through their body. An example is at the track in Japan at Suzuka. That's a really high-speed track, which a lot of the drivers love because it's very technical. There's a lot of high-speed corners of various lengths and difficulty. And for something like 40% of the race, he's withstanding 3 Gs of body weight going through his body from turning. So that equates to like 32 minutes through the race where he has more than 3 Gs of body weight going through his body. So if we look at the head, his head, that's sitting on his neck, let's say that's roughly 5 kilos, helmet's 2 kilos. So that's 7 kilos total. So for 32 minutes of the race, he has 21 kilos of force sort of being pressed through his head, which he has to withstand. That's minus the heavy braking corners on that track as well. So it's actually more than that. But yeah, that's an example.
Wow. And then through the legs, I mean, the braking forces. Can you let us inside some numbers there?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I didn't realise. I mean, when we drive a car and we drive an automatic or a manual, we press the brake and it's pretty easy. It's something we certainly don't have to think about, and there's certainly no real physical effort that goes through there. But a brake in a Formula One car is quite different, and a lot of force is required to go through it to achieve sort of really quick optimal braking. So a good example of this is in Monza, so in Italy. There's the first corner, once again, is a really, really high-speed main straight and then a significant braking where they have to decelerate from about 320 kilometres down to 90 kilometres per hour in 3 seconds or something like this, 2.5 to 3 seconds. They need to apply 75 kilos of force into the brake pedal to achieve that braking, and then there's 50-something laps at that race. So they're doing that repeatedly through their left leg, repeatedly, just 75 kilos of force through the brake pedal every lap. So, in Formula One, drivers often their left calf is stronger because of that, and Romain in particular occasionally has some niggles, nothing too serious, just some niggles through his left Achilles or some left calf tightness as well, which we managed throughout the season.
So they're generating that force lap on lap under a fatigue state on laps, so it's quite remarkable.
When you look at them brake, so they might do a brake test in the garage right while the car's stationary. When you look at them brake, it's almost a full body contraction. They just have this big contraction, particularly through their posterior chain, if that makes sense to you, to apply the force. It's quite impressive to watch. And the mechanics, the mechanics who build the car will also do a brake test, during the day with the engineers to make sure things are working. And they don't get anywhere close to the force that the driver actually puts through the brake pedal. So, yeah, that was something that I found quite interesting.
What's the gap in terms of numerics? What, say, a mechanic versus a trained driver? What's the difference with force?
I don't know the numbers. I'd have to find out for you, sorry. But I've just seen graphs where there's a graph which is rises sharply as you brake and then tapers off up the top. And I've seen the comparison between Romain and his mechanic that does that, and I don't know the numbers, sorry, but there's a significant difference. You just simply can't reach Romain's level.
Yeah, wow. And is there much data sharing between drivers, between teams, and is there much in terms of F1 wanting to get some research done in this area to try and better understand the demands of the drivers?
It's a very good question. So I guess for people that don't know, in Formula One there's 10 teams and there's 2 cars per team, so there's 20 cars in total. Within our team at Haas, the 2 cars, all the data's shared. We can see what Romain's doing compared to the other driver, and we have access to all of that data. Between teams, there's very little data sharing that goes on. Formula One's a very secretive sport as a general rule. So there's very little data sharing that goes on there. From the physical performance side of view, again, historically, physical performance has been pretty poorly monitored in Formula One for 2 real reasons. The first reason being that for whatever reasons, drivers have been pretty secretive about their data, and they haven't wanted to share it between other data. So that makes it very difficult to get any real, data amongst the population. The second one being that the FIA, so the organisation that regulates Formula One, have not approved any form of physical monitoring. So, for example, heart rate monitors are banned. You're not allowed to do any human monitoring whilst in the car for safety reasons. So it's made that very difficult. There has been some sort of recent research that's starting to come out by Peter McKnight, who will be hopefully published later this year, comparing Formula One drivers to NASCAR drivers in America and some other driving disciplines, and looking at some data there. So comparing things like VO2 max, body fat percentage, isometric neck strength, which is promising, but there's still a fair way to go in that field.
So it is an interesting domain by the sounds of it, in that, you know, there's understandably, with the investment that goes into this, the size of the teams, and, you know, you don't want everything out there for public consumption, plus there's safety in other teams' consumption, plus there's safety considerations, which do make sense. So, yeah, I guess watch this space, would you say? Yes,
I think watch this space. Yeah, there's some things that are starting to come in. The drivers currently wear a glove, which has been developed predominantly for medical needs. So it's got a heart rate monitor and basically a pulse oximeter within the glove, which is compulsory for drivers to wear, which allows the doctors at the track to monitor their heart rate and oxygen saturation whilst in the car, particularly to identify whether or not there's been if there's a crash, whether or not the driver has lost consciousness or not. That will hopefully develop more into a performance field, where as coaches and as teams we'll be able to have access to the driver's data and see how they're performing. Sorry, just on that, tell me if I'm talking too much. We have done a little bit of heart rate monitoring in the past within practice sessions. Predominantly, Romain's heart rate will sit around 120 to 140 beats per minute when he's driving, which is pretty submaximal. And then what we found is there's been trends when during particular times of the rate of practice or of whenever he's driving, where he's had to really push, or there's maybe been higher stress, and his heart rate can creep up to about 160 to 170, but otherwise it sits roughly around the 120 to 140 mark.
You know, which is, and I heard you comment on BJSM, you know, you don't see the drivers get out, you know, like they've just run a marathon, you know, but certainly there's that demand on them. But, you know, the thing that impresses me more than anything is the resilience of their bodies with these G-forces.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Traditionally, for Formula One fans, that they always come and say, "Oh, these athletes need to be beasts. You know, they need to be able to run marathons." And people like Mark Webber and Jenson Button and these people have, you know, notable for their triathlons and doing all these ultra races and big mountain bike rides and these things. And so Formula One's always had a bit of a stigma around it, that these athletes need to be really aerobically fit. There's no doubt they need to have, you know, a strong aerobic system, but I think, as you're right, the strength endurance that they require to be able to withstand G-forces and withstand the demands of driving is just as important, and an area that needs to be explored more. And in particular, I think when we have a junior driver that might come and test for us and hop in a Formula One car who's younger and less developed, they get out of the car at the end of the day and you know, they're really sore and they're really tired, and their neck feels weak because it just hasn't withstood the forces of driving a Formula One car. So I think it'd be really good for us to find out, you know, what are the actual strength requirements to drive a Formula One car, and then compare that to junior drivers so that they have some clear targets that they can get, so they know that when they get in the Formula One car, they're ready to go.
And I must ask, you know, with these forces, have you had the chance to drive a car, Kim?
Oh, I'd love to. I mean, it would be straight into the wall. No, unfortunately, I'm too tall. I wouldn't fit. The cockpit is really, really narrow. And, you know, Romain's probably 5'10". He squeezes in there. I wouldn't fit. And it'd also be far too expensive and far too big a risk for me to drive it. However, I would love to experience it, you know, just to really get a good idea of what he's experiencing.
So interesting. I didn't realise there was a height limit. So that means that all the drivers are generally below 6 foot.
There's not a height limit, but there is restrictions to who can get in a car and who can't. Yeah, so 6 foot or less, I would say. Yeah, you could probably get in there at 6'1", I imagine. But then they're certainly not basketballers. So something interesting as well. Sorry to cut you off, mate. Was this year there was a rule change. So previously, as a driver, if you were lighter, you were better. It's similar to a jockey in some regards, but probably not as extreme. But if you were lighter as a driver, you were better. So it tended to favour, you know, short lean people. And then you might have a driver like Nico Hulkenberg or Mark Webber, who's quite tall and naturally more muscular. So the governing body made a rule this year that all drivers need to be a minimum of 80 kilograms. That's wearing their kit, so that's wearing their race suit and with a helmet. So last year, Romain, with his helmet on, was about 72 kilos, and that was probably light for him. We were restricting his calories throughout the year pretty frequently to make sure that he was staying at a light weight. This year, the great thing about 80 kilos is it's really allowed us to put on some decent muscle and a little bit of size, which has been a really, really positive thing, and I think that's a really good initiative by the sport, and something that's had a really good impact.
And I mean, it would certainly speak immediately to resilience with those forces we were just touching on.
Spot on. And interestingly enough, Romain got really strong in the gym over the off season, and his injuries or his post-race soreness has just been massively reduced this year, which has been really positive. So I think it's been a really good step by the FIA.
Kim, working with a V8 race car driver, the Australian series, I had the opportunity to do a few hot laps with the driver, a former guest of the show, featured athlete Tim Slade, and I just remember the speed, and I know the V8s don't hit the same speeds as the F1 cars, but the best way I could describe it was like I felt like my mouth was going to rip itself apart as the car went from 0 to maybe 200 and something before the first corner. Yeah. And I was exhausted. As a fairly aerobically fit individual, I was exhausted after a few hot laps. And to think about doing this for 2 hours, it's, as you say, once again, impressive athletes, impressive talents. Kim, some general questions here. Where do you get inspiration from professionally?
That's a really good question. At the moment, I'm working, particularly physio-wise, in terms of my physio skill set, I'm working reasonably isolated at the moment, which has its pros and has its cons. I've got some good friends and some good sort of networks through the United Kingdom that work in football and some other sports. So I always try to keep in touch with them and try and find out what they're doing from a team setting point of view, just to keep my motivation levels high, and also so that I can just keep delving into that team sport environment, because their human performance is probably far more advanced than what it is in Formula One. That's probably where I get most of my inspiration, and then just various friends and different personal relationships.
I imagine you have a lot of friends in Australia come the opening round every March.
Of course, yeah.
That's brilliant. Kim, what would you say are the top 3 physical characteristics needed for F1 driving? If you could boil it only down to 3 things, what would they be?
Yep, they need to be. They need to have very good trunk and neck strength, number 1. They need to have a reasonable level of cardiovascular fitness, number 2. And then I think they need to be relatively lean, number 3.
Yeah.
Just touching on that research by Pete McKnight earlier. So compared to NASCAR drivers and some other drivers in other disciplines, Formula One drivers, as a general rule, had a higher VO2 max, had higher isometric maximal neck strength and endurance neck strength, and were also leaner than their counterparts. So I don't want to ruin the rest of that study, because hopefully it will come out later this year. But they're probably 3 characteristics of Formula One drivers comparing to other disciplines anyway.
Yeah, so lean, good cardiovascular abilities, and trunk and neck strength.
Yep.
You're listening to this interest edition featuring Kim Keedle, physiotherapist, to Formula One race car driver Romain Grosjean of the Haas Formula One racing team. If you missed last week's episode, an expert edition on all things shoulder pain, here's a little snippet of my conversation with shoulder physiotherapist Jared Powell.
So management is a really great area to talk about, because it essentially says that physiotherapy or strength and conditioning exercises are the best way to manage somebody with anything from a rotator cuff tendinopathy to subacromial bursitis to a partial thickness tear, and even an atraumatic full thickness tear. So all of these pathologies or diagnoses which I've just suggested have a very good evidence base behind them for being managed with a 3-month progressive strengthening regime.
To tune in and hear the full episode, jump over to wherever it is that you get your podcast from and enjoy the full episode. While there, don't forget to peruse the archives dating right back to episode 1 featuring Ironman champion Alistair Day. For now, let's jump back with this interest edition, taking us behind the scenes of what it takes to keep a Formula One race car driver performing at their best with Kim Keedle. Kim, a performance round, which today we're going to call an F1 round. So you ready for some rapid fire fun questions?
Ready, mate.
Your favourite circuit?
Melbourne.
Your favourite driver?
Romain Grosjean.
that was a setup.
That could be a pretty quick sacking if I say anything
of course I know. Oh, you'd put that your heart on your sleeve. Your favourite F1 memory to date?
That's a good question. I'm going to say just Monaco Grand Prix in general because that's just a different experience altogether.
Favourite training session?
Favourite training session? Doing 400 metre repeats at the track.
How many are we talking about?
Somewhere between 12 and 15.
With a minute recovery or?
Recovery, yeah.
Yeah, and that does feature, I believe, on the Drive to Survive documentary.
I think it does, yeah. As I said, I haven't seen it, but I think that might be in there somewhere. I mean, it's always a gruesome session, but enjoyable.
What's the most surprising aspect of F1?
The sheer size of the logistics to make races happen.
Your biggest learning to date?
My biggest learning to date has probably been, various experiences that I've picked up working with different athletes and trying to take different learnings on board from all of them individually. I think, Olympic athletes have a completely different experience to what Romain Grosjean does, for example, but I can pick up just as valuable lessons from them regarding training processes and how to prepare for competition than what I can from Romain, who's a fully paid professional athlete.
What's the hardest training session you've put your athlete through?
Probably not me that I've put him through, to be honest. Dan Sims, the other coach that I mentioned earlier, who's a very good endurance athlete, they do some very hard cross-country ski sessions. So me being from Australia, my cross-country skiing isn't up to their level. So they've done some pretty hard stuff. And
finally, how would you, Kim Keedle, describe an athlete being in the zone?
Oh, yeah, good one. I think achieving a level of calmness and confidence that they can perform the task at hand.
Geez, they're great words. Calmness and confidence. I think that really sums up an F1 driver from the outside looking in from my perspective.
Well, I mean, yeah, not always the case, but it's certainly a goal that we're trying to achieve for sure.
Well, it looks calm from the outside in some instances, right?
It can all turn pear-shaped pretty quickly, let's tell you. But no, it's certainly something that we continue to work on, and I'm sure that's something that he's been working on pretty closely with his sports psychologist as well. And as he continues to grow and mature, those processes are becoming better adapted, and which is really, really positive.
Well done, Kim. You're out of the F1 performance round. On the psychology side, I imagine psychology would be, a staple for every driver.
For most athletes, I think it can be pretty important. I was chatting to a sports psychologist in London a couple of months ago, and he said something which really stuck with me. And it's like, working with a sports psychologist is just adding another tool to the toolbox for an athlete. And often we view it as a negative, where if someone's working with a psychologist, we might, excuse my inelegant terms here, but we might think that they're, mentally weak or maybe a bit of mentally unstable, and that's a negative. But, working with a sports psychologist can have so many positives, even for top performing athletes. There's always some more tools that they can add to their toolbox. So I think it's really positive.
And I always just think there's such strength in getting help. As you say, it's a tool. And
absolutely.
And on that, I mean, what percentage would you break down the performance on a given day for these drivers between physical and psychological?
I'm going to say this: it varies between racetracks because some racetracks are more physically demanding than others. It would be probably I would say as a general rule, it would be a 60-40 split, 60% psychological, 40% physical. One other interesting thing I will just add as a side note, which I've found maybe a little bit bizarre working in Formula One, is the best athlete doesn't always win races because it's very, very heavily reliant upon the car. If you have a really quick car, you don't need to be a great athlete to win races. But you still do need to be a good athlete to drive Formula One cars. There's no doubt about that.
Such an interesting insight. Kim, if you could boil everything you've learnt through your career to date in high performance into one piece of advice for the listener out there trying to pursue and perform at their own physical best, whatever the endeavour, what would Kim Keedle's one piece of advice be?
Probably something that I've certainly become more aware of since travelling and training myself, and also trying to prepare an athlete is the importance of sleep. It doesn't matter how long you sleep for, whatever your sort of optimal time is, but something that I've certainly been working on personally is making sure that I have a good pre-sleep routine, so that I can have a good night's sleep. And of course, you're going to have good weeks and bad weeks, and you might have time when you're jet lagged or not jet lagged, for example. But I know personally that on a good night's sleep, or when I'm going through a really good period of sleep, that my training and my daily performance is better. So I think that's probably been the most powerful thing that I've learned whilst sort of working with athletes and travelling as much as I have.
And that throws to the final question. Every featured guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Kim Keedle's physical challenge for the week going to be? Should
I just say sleep more now that we've been talking about that? No. My physical challenge for the week is that whatever training people are doing, they should try and incorporate maybe 2 or 3 sessions where they're doing some squats. Now, that might be bodyweight squats, that might be back squats, front squats, that might be with a kettlebell, that might be overhead squats with a broomstick. I just think that's for athletic development in general, I think that's a really, really useful movement pattern and just has so many great benefits. And I think everyone feels quite good after they do a little squat session as well.
Yeah, brilliant. So twice a week include squats, whatever the variety.
Brilliant.
Excellent. Kim, last question here. To the listener that is not yet sold on F1 and the interests of it, can you make a little impassioned pitch or plea on why it's important, why you think they need to tune into the next upcoming race at the time of recording, which I believe is Montreal in Canada.
We'll be out in Montreal next week. I think that people should tune in just so that they can get an appreciation of what these drivers are actually doing on a track, and they're not simply just sitting in a car and going around in circles. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it's quite impressive what these guys do.
Brilliant. Kim Keedle, where can we find out more about your world, follow you, etc.?
Yeah, so look, to be honest, email is the easiest. Old-fashioned email. It's just kkeedle@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'm on Instagram. I do have a Twitter handle, but I don't use that too frequently. So they're probably the best places to catch me.
Brilliant. Kim, thank you for your time. And I know it's Geneva there, local time. You still have, I believe, a day ahead of you.
Correct.
So what will that entail? What's on for the rest of the day?
I've actually got the day off this afternoon. So I'm just going to get through a little bit of admin, and I might go for a run. It's a little bit overcast outside, but we'll go out and stretch the legs, I think.
And yourself, are you training for anything in particular?
Nothing in particular at the moment. For those that don't know Geneva's in Switzerland, and the outdoor life here is beautiful. There's a beautiful lake and beautiful mountains around, and some nice countryside. So I've been increasing my running, and I've started doing cycling more professionally, shall we say. So yeah, that's what I'm working on at the moment.
More professionally, as in
no, professionally is the wrong word. I've started cycling. Full stop.
Good man. So you're on a road bike and you got a helmet.
I'm on a road bike and I've got a helmet, and I've started going up a few hills very poorly. But no, I'm really enjoying it. It's just beautiful out here. Beautiful to get out and get some fresh air.
Good on you, Kim. Kim, thanks again for your time, and all the best for the rest of the 2019 Championship Series.
No worries. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did bringing it to you. If you did, then reach out and let Kim know if you have a question for Kim. As you heard, he generously made his email address welcome. You'll find all the handles over at pogophysio.com.au in the show notes. You can also follow Kim over on Instagram at Kim Keedle, Keedle. Be sure to keep the podsies coming. They are a lot of fun. That's simply a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying at any given time and tagging in the show on Instagram at Physical Performance Show. A big thanks for hitting subscribe if you have been enjoying the show. That ensures the episodes come to your earbuds each and every week as they go live, and it really is the single best way to help the show grow. So if you have been enjoying the episodes and you're yet to subscribe, please consider hitting subscribe. A massive thanks to those who have taken the time to leave reviews over on iTunes. These are wonderfully encouraging, and they also serve as a great avenue for feedback on how we can improve the show. This week, a big shout out to Sundoko, who rated the show 5 stars and commented, "One of the best podcasts I've listened to. Excellent guests who know their stuff and hosted by a host who clearly loves his job. Makes me want to live on the Gold Coast so that he can be my physiotherapist." Sundoko, thank you for your review. And hey, if you don't live on the Gold Coast, then maybe source out Kim. He is around the world 20 times a year, so maybe he'll be coming to a city near you. But in all seriousness, thank you for taking the time to leave the review. A massive thanks to the 3 good folk who week in, week out bring this show to you. That is Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Walding on all things graphic design. Another huge thanks to our show sponsor this week, the Gold Coast Marathon. Podcasts, whilst free to download, are not free to produce, so thank you, Gold Coast Marathon. And if you are looking for a great mid-year event, a physical challenge in Australia held on the beautiful Gold Coast, then look no further than the Gold Coast Marathon. Coming up next week on the Physical Performance Show, we go chasing an Australian sporting legend. None other than Glynis Nunn, Order of Australia medalist and 1984 heptathlon Olympic Games champion. I caught up with Glynis recently and we discussed the highs, the lows, and the many learnings from her career. Her career has encompassed so much, the highest of highs, Olympic champion, through to the lowest of lows, and so many learnings from her role in sports administration, coaching, and of course, her own peak performance. It's an episode you're not going to want to miss, so be sure to be tuning in next week for Glynis Nunn, 1984 Olympic Games champion in the heptathlon. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.